thank you everyone for joining us today for our November MemLab Network webinar. Today we have Ethan Gates joining us, and Ethan is the Software Preservation Analyst for Yale University Libraries. And he's going to be talking about digital storage today, because I feel like this is something that we've gone over a little bit in boot camp, and some further ideas and concepts, but with digital preservation, like kind of intro to digital preservation. But this is going to focus a lot on storage, so that way you guys can better answer questions that your patrons might be bringing in to your digital preservation 101 classes. And just for you guys to feel more confident about just your knowledge about digital storage, and going back to your organizations and also your patrons. So Ethan, without further ado, take it away.
Well, thanks, Siobhan, for inviting me in today. I'm super excited to be here and talking to you all. As Siobhan said, I currently work at Yale University Library. I have for about a month now on a grant-funded project, Mellon and Sloan Foundation-funded project, having to do with preservation of legacy digital objects. So you're providing access to digital collections with software that might be outdated. That's kind of a whole other topic today than what really I'm going to talk about. I'm sort of more here speaking from my background. I graduated class of 2015 from NYU's Moving Image Archiving and Preservation graduate program, same as Siobhan, and then worked for about 3 years as the technician for that program. So working directly with students on hands-on training of digitization, digital storage, all these sort of topics that we're talking about here. So this presentation that I'm giving today is a version of a talk that I gave for a few years running in the collection management course of that program. But I am real excited to be here, sort of tailoring it to you all and your concerns. And I really hope that we'll have some good questions at the end of this. As Siobhan said, this is really intended to be, there's going to be a lot of information that I throw at you in this presentation, because it's going to be a bit of a crash course into digital preservation 101, particularly on the topic of storage. But please, if you have any questions, please save them for the end. I've budgeted in about 15 minutes for us to have time to address any of those concerns. And hopefully this, overall, my goal here today is to give you a better idea of how to think through the questions around digital storage and how to think through decisions around what strategies to take in a practical way. Because I'm here to say, first off, right off the bat, that unfortunately there is no one-size-fits-all solution, no matter what library, archive, museum, no matter where you're at, no matter how much your patrons or whoever you're working with may just want you to say, please tell me what to do. You're really going to have to go back and have a discussion with them. And that's sort of what my presentation here today is aimed at, is how to have that discussion and what questions to ask, and how to narrow it down. So I'm just going to share my slides here. One moment, please. All right, so you should all be seeing my screen at this point. Yeah, so a quick agenda. After we get through this introduction, I'm going to be talking about risk factors and causes of digital loss. So what are we worried about? What are we really talking about when we talk about digital loss and the dangers for digital collections and perils of digital storage? And I'm going to get into strategy and planning, so some sort of high-level concerns and strategies for addressing those problems and those risk factors, and then narrow that down to the largest part of our discussion, which will be more practical options for storage, talking about advantages, disadvantages of various physical media and formats, talking about advantages of cloud and online storage, around software that will help you with your storage, and execute the tasks and the strategies that I'm going to address in the previous section, and ultimately talk a little bit about data recovery and what you have, the options that you and your patrons or your communities have for when all these things fail, if it's not enough, your strategy, and then go into Q&A. So I'm going to dive right into risk factors and causes of digital loss. What are we scared of? And we can see some of our big topics here fall into usually broad categories of hardware failure, software failure, degradation and bit rot, natural disasters, and human error. And I'm going to dive into each one of these categories and talk a little bit more about them specifically. Just check the time here. Great. So hardware failure. This is really basic. When we were talking about digital loss, there's always a possibility with computers, which are composed of physical, often mechanical components, that there could be something that breaks down with those components, whether it's spinning mechanical parts in a disk drive breaking, whether there's plastic pieces on the inside of your computer that melt or break or what have you, electrical failure. There are circuit boards, there are physical circuit boards inside your computer that can go wrong for all sorts of reasons, dust, clutter, buildup, static shock, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the sort of large category of possible failure to have to plan for, is planning around the physical aspects of digital storage, which is computers and drives, et cetera, et cetera. And obsolescence around hardware is a big concern as well, in terms of the rapid pace of development of computer technology. A drive, we see this over the years with various media moving forward, no longer becoming in vogue, whether it was floppy drives, then CD-ROMs, various physical components of hardware and the digital storage technology becoming no longer supported or created by manufacturers, and thus posing a danger to digital collections that were possibly stored on those formats. Software failures. This is probably this is where my current job really comes into play. This concept of obsolescence or software rot, as I kind of like to call it, which is the idea of makers of software, as they create new versions, eventually no longer supporting certain features, no longer supporting certain file formats that previous versions of even the same software did. So we can see this even in say, FileMaker Pro databases, where after a certain number of version upgrades, they no longer can open files that were created with an older version of the software. As I said, this is my primary concern that I'm trying to address with my current job, but it's a huge issue with, again, legacy digital storage and digital collections, where if you're returning to digital files after a certain amount of time, you may no longer have the software to open it. And that's a problem where you may have even preserved the file itself, theoretically, bit for bit, all of the information, all the data, but if you can no longer access it in any meaningful way, have you really actually preserved that information or that file? It's essentially lost. Other forms of software failure or threats to digital information. Incompatibility. We see this between operating systems, just not being able to open files created with certain software on Windows on a Mac machine, for instance, between hard drives that are formatted in various systems. Again, that sort of interoperability and certain companies in the digital sphere not playing nice with each other. The fragmentation caused by that can be an issue, again, as you're trying to preserve and access your digital files moving forward, no matter what they're stored on. A lack of transparency in a software sense usually means software not being clear about what it is actually doing. That can be a concern sometimes, especially with commercial pieces of software where they might claim that they are doing, well, what am I trying to say here? Basically, like especially with like video files, say like re-encoding the file, doing things that aren't always clear about what's happening on the back end in terms of you not actually preserving the file or getting the same file at the end of a workflow or a process that you thought you started with. And viruses and malware, not as big a concern, I would say, perhaps as it was even 10, 15, 20 years ago to the average consumer. Bad actors these days are really focused, as we've seen in the news, on say, scraping data, scraping login information, and acting on people's exposures and weaknesses that way, rather than, say, holding their digital files hostage on their computer. Ransomware is not as common as it was, again, say, 15 years ago. But it is still out there. We saw that, I think, a year or two ago with the WannaCry crisis story that you may all have seen, but increasingly less active. Degradation and bit rot. Degradation, I'm really referring to generally physical deterioration of media, of the actual physical format, the digital storage medium on which our files are kept. So that can refer to, in a hard disk drive sense, that might mean a loss of magnetic orientation or damage to an actual metal splitting platter on a hard disk. On a CD-ROM, it could mean a physical deterioration of the organic dyes that actually make a CD-ROM work, or in terms of magnetic data tape, it could mean the same sort of degradation that we see with analog audiovisual magnetic media and loss of adhesive binder or of magnetic particles. Again, physical degradation of the actual media is a concern. Bit rot is this you'll see a lot of different vague terms for what bit rot is. Some people will just use that to refer to digital loss and loss of digital data at all for any of the reasons that we're talking about here. I think that it's a little more helpful to think about it as this scary concept of gradual corruption, which is to say we don't often necessarily know how to pin down what bit rot is, or in any meaningful specific way, which is this is when you go to open up a file and there's just corruption, and there's not necessarily any physical deterioration, there's not necessarily any identifiable reason for why a file that's just been sitting on a drive or sitting on a disk for a few years would suddenly not be able to open. The software is still compatible. All other reasons point to it. You still being able to open and use and access that file. But there are any sorts of numbers of reasons why very small failures in a digital signal could cause it to suddenly give you an error message like what we're seeing here with this PowerPoint file. So I don't want to scare people with bit rot, but it is a sort of catch-all term for our unexplainable and unidentifiable reasons for digital loss. Natural disasters is also a pretty obvious, obvious in the way that we're used to natural disasters being a possibility for loss for physical collections. Obviously, disaster planning is a pretty normal process at libraries, archives, museums, anyone with physical collections. But I really like to point out, for various reasons, that things like fire, earthquakes, floodings, these environmental crises that we're seeing more and more, unfortunately, can also be a threat to digital storage, including network storage and servers. We saw in the wake of Hurricane Sandy in New York City that there were a lot of data centers in downtown Manhattan that hosted quite a lot of data for, say, large business and computing IT companies in New York that were hosting their data there. lost some of their data because of damage to servers. The cloud is not actually a cloud. There is always a physical location with data centers somewhere, and if that location where the data centers are comes under threat from one of these natural disasters, it can pose as much of a threat to that as flooding to a library basement. And this can affect manufacturing as well. I do also like to point out this case with I don't know if anyone remembers, but the 2011 tsunami and subsequent significant flooding in Thailand, which actually affected the world's hard drive manufacturing supply for about a year. That there was a significant shortage of hard disk drives, which really can trickle down to pricing and supply that you might have to plan for in your digital storage strategies, whether you're an institution or just one-on-one for any person. Human error is also a big one. And this is where we're just talking about people not handling their digital storage media properly, unintentionally using software to delete, overwrite, modify their data, modify their files in a way that they didn't intend. And so as we're planning for digital storage strategies, we've got to take that into account in some way. So those are the big, that's an overall summary of our concerns. And I want to get now into some high-level planning in terms of how we're actually going to address all these concerns. How can we think in a high-minded way about strategies and administrative concerns? I mean, and I say administrative, but not just at institutions, but really, on a personal level. Sorry there. So how we can address possible causes of digital loss in a way that, if one of these failures or threats happens to us, that we can be secure in our knowledge that our digital storage strategy has left us with a safe backup. So intellectual control is always a big thing to point out to people, that it's always going to be easier to manage your digital files and keep them going into the future if you know what you have. And this is the big concern. I mean, this is a personal concern even. I know this is one of those do as I say, not as I do sort of scenarios where I don't know how many people actually keep an inventory of all their photos and all their files, but it's really going to help you know moving forward. It's kind of impossible to tell what you've lost if you don't know what you had to begin with. So encouraging people, after they've come in for, say, a digitization session or transferring their files over from an obsolete medium, whatever it is that they've done in your labs, to sort of take this as an opportunity to take stock of exactly what it is they're coming out with, to organize them in some way, usually whether that's with an identifiable naming convention, folder structure, folder hierarchy, a way of looking quickly at their digital storage and being able to identify right off the bat or within only a few minutes what it is they're actually looking at, rather than having to open up every single file and sort through that every single time that they want to know what they have. And if we could take away literally any slide or any concept from this lecture today, I would really love you all to think about redundancy, which is literally just the recommendation that lots of copies keep stuff safe. No matter what, moving forward, no matter how smart your digital storage strategy, the best way to ensure that you're not losing your files is to keep multiple copies of them. And there is this particular rule that you'll see mentioned sometimes called the 3-2-1 strategy, which is encouraging people, institutions, libraries, whoever, to keep ultimately 3 total copies of their of any given file on. So that's 3 total copies, including 2 local, which is to say near your physical person, copies, but on different devices. So that could be 2 different hard drives, a hard drive and a optical disk, a hard drive and a data tape, whatever your strategy. But then at least one copy off-site, which is to say geographically separated, which is a way of ensuring that we avoid that sort of like that natural disaster concern, right? Which is to say if there's any sort of geographic catastrophe in one place that affects your 2 local copies, that you can be assured that there is one copy off-site, that there is not affected by that particular crisis. This obviously becomes a concern the more you trickle down to your average, library patron, your average family member, your average friends. Might not have the time, the money, the concern to implement a full, manage a full 3-2-1 strategy. But really, again, my recommendations are at least 2 copies, and to, if at all possible, observe the offsite rule. In terms of like keeping a drive with a family member, keeping a drive somewhere else, I don't care where it is, but keep 2 copies with one not right directly on the shelf next to the other copy. And the cloud, I'll say like right off the bat, the cloud storage is an excellent way of addressing that particular rule. We'll get more into that later when I dive into cloud storage a little more in depth. But just in talking about redundancy, yes, that cloud storage does sort of satisfy that offsite rule. Fault tolerance is another sort of method of redundancy that I want to talk about. This can get complicated, but it's a thing that I really want to encourage, particularly small institutions or organizations, anyone who's doing this for a community rather than perhaps just themselves, to think about. There are ways of taking individual pieces of media, in this case, generally hard drives, because again, I'll get into a little bit more, but hard drives tend to be mostly what we're talking about here. There are ways of taking multiple individual drives and arranging them in ways that will protect the data if one of those drives fails. So we're taking at least like 2, possibly more hard drives and arranging them into what's called a logical volume. If you were to plug one of these enclosures that you're seeing here on this slide into a computer, you would see it pop up on your computer desktop as if it was just one flash drive or one external hard drive, even though there's technically multiple drives contained within them. And the advantage that we're seeing with that is that there are ways for those enclosures are essentially serving, there's ways to arrange them, pieces of software that you can work with that will help arrange the data in those drives in a way that's advantageous to redundancy and making sure to account for failure. And this is, again, I assume these slides are all going to be shared. This recording is going to be made available, so please don't try and memorize all of this data, this information at once. But just what I'm talking specifically about here is RAID, this concept of redundant arrangement of independent disks, and there are different levels of RAID, so you will see these different numbers. Sometimes you'll see this JBOD, just a bunch of disks arrangement mentioned in connection with RAID. I want to emphasize that that's not really a RAID, in that there is no redundancy contained within that. That's essentially just saying if you, say, have 2 hard drives and both of them are 1 terabyte capacity, they work together as one unit to form one 2 terabyte unit, which is to say there's no redundancy in there. You've boosted your capacity and made it a little bit easier to manage your files as one volume on your computer at the same time. But there's no protections involved with that. It's literally just a matter of convenience of plugging in one enclosure with 2 drives in it rather than plugging in 2 drives at the same time. With at least 2 drives, though, you can get some advantages like RAID 0. although RAID 0 is a method of data striping, which is meant to improve read-write speed and performance, which is to say, it essentially, when you're digitizing video, for instance, you might want to look into this for the drive, for the computer, for whatever you're initially capturing the digitized video onto, because it can boost your drive's performance and keep up with a lot of data very quickly. So if you're dealing with, say, a lot of uncompressed video data at the same time, this will help your software sort of like keep up with that. But again, it's not a great option for redundancy or for protecting data for the long term, because if either one of those drives fails, you can sort of see in the arrangement, if file A has been split across two drives, if either one of these drives were to fail, you would lose the whole file. You would lose the whole data, all the data, because you had essentially lost half of the file. RAID 1 is really where I want to start talking about redundancy and encouraging people to think about that for their storage. RAID 1 is a method of mirroring. So again, say we have an enclosure, a hard disk drive enclosure that has two drives in it. What's happened here is essentially the data has been mirrored. We have exactly the same file copied from one drive over to the other. So this helps ensure data protection, because if one of those drives fails, the entire file is contained on the other drive. You haven't lost anything. The disadvantage to this is that you have decreased your capacity by half, because you're essentially just you've just bought an enclosure or bought a device to do the copying for you, but you haven't actually ensured any redundancy. Well, what am I trying to say? You haven't actually like boosted your capacity at all. If each of these drives is 1 terabyte, your total capacity is still only 1 terabyte, because it's the same data copied once and then over. You can get into some really more complicated arrangements once you boost the number of drives, but there are RAID levels that say, like, if you have at least 3 drives, you can arrange them in such a way that if any one of those 3 drives fails, all the data, again, can be restored, can be rebuilt. You haven't lost anything. And they're usually hot swappable, which is in the sense of just saying you can pop a drive in or out at any time, whether they fail or whether you're even just scared of them failing. And then RAID 6 is another level that you can jump to if you're dealing with an enclosure that has at least 5 drives, which ensures 2 drive protection. Again, how this all works on a sort of technical level, I don't necessarily want to get into right this minute, but these are strategies that you should really look into if you're dealing with a lot of data. Again, this is like saying with 6 drives, 1 terabyte each. That's we're talking about, you know, small organization level collections, probably more than any one individual. I'm going to just take a quick drink here. All right, and so in addition to the idea of redundancy and just keeping multiple copies of things at all time, the other main point that I want to drive home today, and I want you to take to whoever it is that you're talking to about digital storage, is migration, which is this idea that there just is no silver bullet strategy, no silver bullet format in the digital world that we can just put on a shelf and have it last for 100 years, unfortunately, the same way that we did with, say, celluloid film. It hasn't happened yet. And so the only way that we're going to be able to preserve digital information moving forward right now is to kind of keep it moving and to keep migrating all your data onto new drives, onto new formats, onto new media, onto a new physical object. I would say every 5 years is a good amount of time to account for whether it's the failure of that drive or that physical piece of media itself, whether it's to account for software failure, operating system obsolescence, hardware obsolescence, all those things that I mentioned at the top of our talk here. And also, they're going to give you an opportunity, if you come up with a sort of plan for doing this on the regular, scheduling it in advance, it gives you an opportunity to maintain fixity during transfer. And I want to talk for another minute here about what file fixity is. Fixity is just the idea that a file remains fixed, that it does not change over time, which is a way of dealing with corruption, is a way of dealing with accidental modification, user error that I mentioned earlier. And what this usually translates into on a day-to-day level is computation and validation of what's called a checksum. Checksums they were invented for the data encryption and sort of privacy and security field, but they have turned into a useful tool for digital preservation as well. Essentially, what happens is a checksum generator is an algorithm. It's a mathematical equation. And if you run that algorithm on a file, any file, which is just a long string of ones and zeros in the digital sense, it will come back with a hash, a string. It's a combination of numbers and letters that seems random, but is actually based specifically on that string of ones and zeros, on that file that you gave to the algorithm. And if you run that algorithm against that file, against that same specific string of ones and zeros, every single time it should return back that same string of numbers and letters. So what this means is that we can run that algorithm once now, and then in 5 years, if we run that algorithm against the file again in 5 years, and it gives us the exact same string of numbers and letters, we can be sure that there hasn't been any corruption. There hasn't been any of that bit rot that I was talking about before, because it returned that same string. So we know that none of the ones and zeros are different. It's exactly the same string, exactly the same file that we had before. This is I've shown a picture here of a terminal, and if you're not used to the command line, that can be very scary, but I will emphasize that there are a lot of pieces of software, graphic programs that will do this for you as well. So there are much more, say, user-friendly ways of accomplishing this task of tracking file fixity. But just to throw out some terms that you will see if you look into this process anymore, these are just names of again, those kinds of encryption algorithms that we've borrowed in the digital preservation world. You will see MD5 a lot. You will see the security hash algorithm. All these SHA checksum generators are all just sort of variations on the same algorithm for various complexity. If we look here, the difference here is basically just this is an MD5 checksum. It's much shorter in terms of the total string of numbers and letters used versus I think this is a SHA-256 checksum here. In theory, the longer the string of numbers and letters, actually the more accurate the checksum is in checking fixity. But again, this is just sort of speaking from my personal experience. I've found that MD5 checksums generally do the job of identifying problem files, and that the SHA algorithms tend to be a bit of overkill, again, since they were designed originally for encryption rather than digital preservation, and they do take they can take a lot of time and computer processing power to generate. So a thing to keep in mind. And tech support. I like to emphasize this when we're talking about strategy and how to plan around how to plan your digital storage. That no one's in it alone. that any good strategy involves a fallback option for essentially asking for help, and whether that's a commercial solution, whether you are working with a piece of software or working with a piece of hardware that comes with specific guarantees of support when things go wrong. That's great, and there can be also third-party services that offer that as well, and if that's within your budget, go for it. But there's also a lot of community tech support. Literally everyone is dealing with this in the world right now. We are migrating into a digital world, and I get the sense a lot of talking with people, whether it's friends or family, who are concerned about their digital files, who are concerned about their collections, that sort of everyone feels very isolated and like they're alone and they're the only ones who have to deal with this problem of moving their files and moving their content into the future. And you're not. Like there are avenues out there, whether it's user forums or all sorts of communities that are available, and I'm happy to speak some more to that later, maybe if there are questions. But again, another point that I like to emphasize. So I'm just going to take one more break quick. And we are doing great on time. Awesome. So the longest section here that I want to talk about are practical options for storage. Once we've taken all of these broad-minded concerns for loss and strategy into play, what does that actually sort of mean? How does that play out on a day-to-day level? What are our options? So to talk about physical formats and the various media that we have available, some advantages and disadvantages of all of them. The most common that you're going to see, and probably the best recommendation, especially with that redundancy and multiple copies in mind, is hard disk drives. They are cheap, they are available, their storage is increasing all the time in terms of there being sort of active manufacturer development on creating 8 terabyte drives, 10 terabyte drives, 12 terabyte drives. The community is always sort of moving forward in terms of driving up the capacity while driving down the cost for, say, it's way cheaper to buy a 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte drive than it was even 5 years ago. So that's a distinct advantage that we have as consumers, especially if you're not working with video. If you are working with video, this can be more of a concern since those files tend to be bigger and you tend to generate a lot more data. But if you're working with photos, files, that cost efficiency to hard drives is a real boon. In terms of disadvantages, the hard disk drives are a mechanical format, which is to say there inside every hard disk drive is actual several metal plates that spin, and there is a head that reads that data, kind of not unlike a turntable and vinyl discs in a way, although there is no contact actually happening here between the head and the drive. In fact, that is a point of failure if the head that we see here starts making contact with the platters. That causes scratches and that actually deletes data. So that's a mechanical failure that you can have that can be caused by contact. Dropping a hard disk drive could easily cause something to move out of alignment. They are very susceptible to mechanical problems. If anything in that process of spinning and reading and all these little metal and plastic parts goes wrong, you can very quickly have cause for concern. And another thing that we want to observe with hard disk drives in particular is this concept called the bathtub curve that we see with hard disk drives. And what I mean by that and hard disk drive failure is that what we see when you buy a hard disk drive is that they tend to either fail right off the bat out of the factory. So when you first try to plug in a hard drive and power it on and spin it up, there is this they call the infant mortality failure, which is just it just right off the bat doesn't work. There was a defect with it out of the factory, and it's not going to work. And then we tend to see over time, like as long as it spins up that first time, hard drives tend to work well, provided, again, there's none of that human error, no dropping it, no mishandling. For, say, 3, 4, 5 years, that hard drives tend to work well. And then over time, they start to have an increased failure rate as those parts get older and just wear and tear tends to break them down. So that's a thing to watch out for as you're planning your strategy. If you're buying hard disk drives in order to plan out your next several years of keeping your files, you want to be sure to power them on pretty soon to check that for that sort of infant mortality failure, and then be sure to plan for ultimate migration once you hit the other end of the bathtub curve at the end of 4 or 5 years. And that goes for, that's speaking generally for all kinds of hard drives. There are also, tendencies within manufacturing, depending on what brand and what model of hard drive, how many terabytes, what the capacity is. There are all sorts of variations that happen within those, just within hard drives, that can cause concern. So Backblaze, I like to highlight, as a cloud storage company that actually publishes all of their data about all the tens of hundreds of thousands that they of hard disk drives that they use for their service. And as you can see, sort of like they will break it down by manufacturer, by model, by drive count, by drive capacity, what the failure rate is that they're seeing with those drives over time, which is a really kind of useful thing for the community. It can be very overwhelming to look at all this data and trying to sort out like what's a small sample size, for instance. I mean, you might say, like, be really scared by this 13% hard drive failure rate on this one particular model, but then see that they actually don't have that many drives that they've tested. It can be a lot to sort through that. I will say, just having looked at this, read a bunch of these reports, and from personal experience, that if you're talking about consumer level models of hard drive, which I would put in, say, like the 1 terabyte to 4 terabyte range is generally what people can look at from an affordable perspective these days. Don't go with Seagate. That they tend to have the higher failure rates on those sort of lower capacity ends. But whereas, just from personal experience, I can highly recommend the Western Digital My Passport line, which works with all sorts of operating systems and drives, and they have several models ranging from 1 to 2 terabytes, I think maybe 4 terabytes, and it's a solid range for recommending to family, friends, patrons, etc. Beyond hard drives, we have increasingly solid-state drives, which, again, as we're seeing these getting very common in laptops, since hard drives are heavy and tend to, really up the weight of your portable laptop or your iPad, your Chromebooks, whatever. Those are all running on solid-state drives, which are electrical. There are no mechanical parts to them. They are just all run by these little circuit boards and breakers. The distinct advantage to that is obviously, like, they are much less prone to mishandling. It's a lot harder to just to break or cause failure from a solid-state drive by dropping it or scratching it or anything like that. But they have a lot more limited capacity. They are more expensive to manufacture right now. So that's why you'll see, a 1 terabyte solid state drive costs a lot more than a 1 terabyte hard drive. So that's definitely a concern if you're planning. And again, if you're planning to migrate in a few years anyway, that can be a real cost benefit to have to weigh. That's increasingly, again, just in the manufacturing computing market. They are coming down. They are less expensive than they were even 3, 4, or 5 years ago for larger capacities, and that's only going to increase. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And to be clear, this doesn't just include these sort of like bigger solid state drives that you see in laptops. It's the same principles and the same format that you'll see in, say, like photo cards, camera cards, or USB-sized flash drives. It's the same basic grounded technology, but obviously capacity tends to be sort of the difference between these cards or your USB keys and a larger external or internal solid-state drive. And the other concern to point out about solid-state drives and that electrical technology is that while they're not mechanical and therefore a little less subject to wear and tear from a physical perspective of plastic and metal and parts breaking down, they are susceptible to a lack of electrical insulation, which is basically saying that the more you use them over time, which is to say the more that you copy files onto them, the more that you copy files off of them, that will contribute to possible data loss or failure from a solid state drive over time. They have relatively poor write endurance, as it's called. So in terms of an option for, say, I'm going to copy my files onto a solid state drive once and then not worry about it again for the 3, 4, 5 years until my next migration, and not touch them in the meantime, that can be a good option. Optical disks. This is the section where I beg you and everyone you know never to use optical disks again. And I know from talking with friends and family that there are lots of people, particularly in older generations, who still want these. But the writing is really on the wall. Just from a market perspective, the hardware is becoming less common. It's going to be harder to get data off of CD-ROMs or DVDs or whatever in the near future. We're already seeing this, with laptops and desktops even not coming with disk drives. That hardware obsolescence has to come into play here. They're extremely prone to mishandling from a physical perspective. It's compared to a hard drive or a solid state drive or nearly any other kind of digital media format. It's so easy to scratch a CD-ROM or any kind of optical disk, which can cause the drive to not read the data on the disk properly. And no matter how many solutions you see for toothpaste on disks and cleaners and what have you, I'm personally really skeptical about those methods being fully effective in getting all the data off of a damaged or scratched disk from a sort of digital preservation perspective. And their lifespan, you'll see a lot of guarantees from manufacturers around optical disks and them lasting 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 100 years. I've seen crazy formats claiming to be archival. But there's very little data from any actual third-party independent sources, that is to say not the manufacturers making those disks, that those claims are true. And from what data has been done by, say, the Library of Congress, I know has done some studies. I've seen a few other third-party vendors talk about this. The lifespan of CD-ROMs, DVD-ROMs, etc., just really, really depends on the materials that were used, the organic dyes that were used inside the plastic that actually make a disk work, and the conditions of the storage environment. There's just so many factors that can really limit the lifespan of optical disks, particularly when it comes to on the consumer level. The kinds of disks that you would see, the like CD-RWs or DVD-RWs, meaning read-write, the kinds of disks that were often available to consumers for copying files onto and off as if they were, say, like a USB drive or a hard drive. Those disks that were kind of the most common for, making your mix CDs or copying your photos too, those are actually the worst in terms of their lifespan. And if you have any of them, you need to get your data off of them as soon as possible. And if you wrote on top of them in Sharpie, they're almost certainly you're going to have issues with actually getting all of your files off of them, just because, again, the top layers of optical disks are actually really crucial to reading the data properly. And moving forward, there are, I throw up here that like Sony is pretty much the only manufacturer that's even still trying to do anything with optical disks in creating these cartridges that have optical disks on the inside. But they're really limited adoption in terms of that community support that I was talking about before. Like, you're not really going to get any of that. And even then, their capacity, 1 terabyte, 1.5 terabytes, is really limited compared to what you could get with an equivalent hard disk drive. And it requires this specialized equipment. You need a special drive in order to even read those special cartridges. So I really have zero confidence about these becoming adopted in any sort of viable format into the future. And I'll throw out, I do just want to talk about for a minute LTO, which stands for Linear Tape Open, which is a magnetic data tape format. This, again, is not going to be your solution for your friend or your family. It requires specialized equipment. You have to buy special drives, special cartridges. They're way more intended for enterprise or organizational excuse me, collections than sort of one-on-one consumers. But if you are a small organization, perhaps, or lower level institutions that can think about this, they are advantageous in terms of their capacity being pretty equivalent to hard disk drives, and again, sort of similar to solid state in the idea that once you put the data onto them, once you put your files onto them, they're going to be pretty stable for, say, the next 5, 10, 15 years at least. They have the concerns of audiovisual magnetic media in terms of, the longer lifespan, 20, 30, 40 years, who knows? Like we might start seeing concerns with data tape losing information. But again, if you're planning migration every 5 years and you're baking that into your storage strategy, they are very stable within that 5 years, we can say, pretty confidently. So they can be a good midterm solution for places that have a lot of data and need just sort of a one copy that doesn't get accessed a lot. They are very slow, however, because it's literally a piece of tape inside a cartridge that has to spool out, as opposed to a hard disk drive that can spin and access data much more quickly. I also want to mention here physical interfaces and data transfer protocols, which is to say how you connect to all these various formats that I've been talking about, whether it's a hard disk drive, whether it's optical disk drives, whether it's solid state. A concern you also have to keep in mind is how that drive, how that disk is connecting to your computer and how you're accessing it, and how quickly the data can move, how quickly you can copy data from one drive to another, because this is changing all the time. In terms of hardware obsolescence, again, which can be a pretty effective way of trapping data on one piece of media, it is often a matter of, oh, this is using some USB cable connector that I don't have. Because, I mean, the USB is a particularly egregious example because they've changed their cables, literally how the physical connector for their cables so much over the year, but also the protocol for, we went from USB 2 to USB 3 to the USB 3.1, which is the sort of like interchangeable up and down USB-C physical connector that you see on laptops most of the time now. And every time, that usually has to do with how quickly the data is moving over the cable. So, yeah, for planning your long-term storage, it might not be probably the physical connector is the biggest concern. Whether like am I going to be able to actually plug this drive in to my computer and access the files in, again, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. You have to kind of keep up with whatever the developments are in that area. I mean, USB is fairly well known since it's implemented in pretty much whatever, in one physical form or another, across more or less all computers these days. But I do like to mention FireWire, which was Apple's proprietary data connection that they used for quite some time on their desktop and laptops. It's phased out now, but you might remember these sort of blocky square connectors. I just want to mention that those are compatible with Thunderbolt, which is the new Apple proprietary data protocol and connection that they came up with 5, 6 years ago at this point. So I do like to mention it just because people often do still have hard drives or various other disks that are perhaps using this, and it's possible as long as you can find adapters for these physical connections to port them over to computers that use Thunderbolt instead. But you might get stuck in Apple dongle hell, where none of us are going to escape that because they're just going to continue to change their connections and make sure we have to use as many dongles as possible. Sorry. And I'll mention Ethernet connections. So these cables and connections that you might be probably most used to for wired internet connections, you can often use those for, say, those like hard disk drive enclosures that I was mentioning before when talking about RAID. You might see those for little desktop network units as a possible connection. Again, maybe not if you're not going to do this, you see this connection or work with it if you're only working with one external hard drive or optical drives or anything like that. But if you are working with a slightly more souped up, sophisticated enclosure or equipment setup, you might see these connections. And in generally the speeds on those are pretty good if you have those. They can be advantageous compared to some USB connections, for instance. Apologize, getting a little scratchy here, but I'm going to soldier on. Cloud storage, I do want to talk about at this point. At this point, a cloud literally is like, cloud storage is a data center with someone else with hundreds of thousands of hard disk drives. That's all it is. And they're thinking about the same concerns that we've gone over here today in terms of sort of high-level management, redundancy, fixity, migration. They're thinking about all of these things. It's literally, when you're going with a cloud storage option, all you're doing is paying someone else or asking someone else to do that for you. And that's fine, but just as with any professional service, you have to think about exactly what the terms are that you're agreeing to. You are handing over something, in this case, your data, to a third-party storage, and what you get back from that in terms of ability to access them, in terms of managing them, downloading them back, downloading the original copies back that you originally gave to them. That's all going to depend on who you're going with. Because you have essentially ceded control over the physical management of your files, or one copy of your files. So again, it's cheap. It's ensuring geographic separation for at least one copy of your data. I don't mean to discourage anyone from cloud services, but it's just like, agree what, understand what it is you're agreeing to and the concerns that you might have when working with another company. And to clarify when I'm talking about cloud and online storage here, this is like services that are specifically dedicated to file management, where I'm saying Google Drive, Box, Dropbox even. I would like to contrast that with, say, social media, which you'll get a lot of perhaps people asking whether that counts, or and the short answer from my perspective is social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, those are platforms for sharing. They're not for saving. They are not intended to be digital preservation platforms. They are not intended to be a place where you keep one copy of all your files as part of a large digital storage strategy. They are, this is very clear when you go into terms of service. And this is an easier conversation to have now, given everything that's happened with, say, Facebook in the past couple of years compared to even a year or two ago. People get this conversation a lot more than they did in terms of, the ad targeting and the fact that a social media company might be, actually looking through my files and using that data for selling ads or whatever it is that they're going to do. This idea of us not necessarily knowing everything that we're buying into with the terms of service. And I like to sort of bring up whatever the most recent cautionary tale is. So I do want to just go over the story of Flickr that I don't know if anyone has noticed this past month. But Flickr was actually a really interesting case, or has been an interesting case for the past few years, because it was sort of somewhere between a social media platform and a cloud storage service, I would say. It was, designed around sharing and community of photos, but it was very photographer and user focused in terms of the terms of service was very generous on licensing and actually honoring, whatever copyright license a user wanted to apply to a photo that they uploaded. They were very generous in terms of embedded metadata and you being able to download a copy of exactly the original file that you first uploaded to the service. They were very generous in terms of free accounts offering unlimited storage, which is what just changed, I think at the beginning of November that they just announced this, that as of, I think they gave about 3 months, but after that point, all free accounts will only have for storage for 1,000 photos, and anything more than 1,000, you have to upgrade to a paid Flickr Pro account if you want the unlimited as many photos as possible storage plan, which has huge implications for, I know a number of nonprofit organizations. The Library of Congress stores their I believe their public photo archive on Flickr for people to access. So there's all sorts of implications for the nonprofit community around and the internet in terms of legacy collections and legacy photos that are hosted on Flickr. This is, I'll say, compared to some of the situations and services we've seen like this, the fact that they even gave 3 months for people to plan and pull down their photos and come up with some sort of strategy for dealing with anything over 1,000 that they have is relatively generous. We've seen much worse scenarios, but it's just always something to keep in mind, that when you're handing over your files to third-party cloud or social services, that they often hold the power in terms of what's going to happen to those moving forward. Software options. This is a very broad topic in terms of software that can be used to accomplish all these administrative and managerial strategical tasks of digital storage. It's so hard for me to even begin to address this topic because, for everything that I've been talking about, there are 5, 6, 7, 10, 20, a dozen, 100 pieces of software that could potentially help you to perform that task. There are plenty of programs, pieces of software that will help you with file fixity, that will help you with migration, that will help you with making backups and making multiple copies that are, exact from one drive to another. There is lots of support out there to help you to accomplish these tasks. So sorting through and actually finding one to recommend is going to be a case-by-case basis. But in terms of what you should be looking for and the concerns to have, closed source versus open source, which is to say, like, whether the company or the maker of any piece of software makes the source code that makes the program work available to a community for review, can be a big concern that in terms of transparency that I was mentioning earlier, and as a threat to data, the idea that the community can go in and make sure that a program is doing exactly what it says it claims to do can be big. But you do tend to perhaps see less adoption among open source software. That you'll have smaller communities perhaps coalesce around open source versus closed source commercial options like Adobe or Apple or sort of big names in software development. But I do like to emphasize that open source is not the same thing as free, and that there are plenty of commercial open source options. There are companies that are based around open source software that will still happily take your money to offer tech support or assistance with their software and accomplishing the whatever task of data backup and recovery or security, whatever it is you're trying to do. But honestly, my thing with picking a piece of software to accomplish whatever task it is you're trying to do, the best recommendation is to look for wide adoption, look for things that other people are doing, look for that community support that I was mentioning earlier. If you have a question or if you're seeing something with your own data, with your own collections, with your own files, the thing to tell people is that someone else has almost certainly encountered that, and you're going to find more help if you're using an option, whether it's paid or not, around larger communities. So quickly, I do just want to, awesome, we're doing well on time, talk about data failure and recovery and a few options for what to do if it's too late, essentially. Like what if I have a drive failure? What if I have data loss? What if I think I can't recover some files? What can I do? There are options available to you as well, or to your patrons, to your communities. Just in terms of training people a bit for how to look for data failure and loss, I just tell people, trust your eyes and trust your ears. You're not going crazy. If you think you've lost something, you quite possibly have. Trust your eyes. If you're seeing error messages around corruption or anything else, if you're seeing missing files, if you're seeing folders hanging and getting sort of that spinning beach ball of death on Macs when you try to open files on an external drive, these are possible signs that your media is failing or that something is happening that's not ideal, obviously, and particularly with hard drives. Listen to your hard drives. If they're not sounding normal, something's happening. It's as simple as that. If they're not spinning, if they make beeping noises, if there's scratching, if there's clicking, these are all signs that something with your hard drive is not functioning as intended, and that you should look to copy over your files or look for data recovery options as soon as possible. In terms of actual data recovery options, I mean, just going to emphasize once again, to planning ahead and redundancy are just your best friends in terms of in cases of data loss. There's nothing simpler than recovering data than if you just have another copy of it and you can make another copy of it from that first copy. But if you don't, there are, again, plenty of software options out there that will vary on all sorts of factors of cost, of user friendliness, how easy it is to navigate and understand what it is that they're saying, whether they're Windows, whether they're Mac, whether they're both. Again, this is a very common problem that many people are happening. You're not the only person who's having these problems, and there are a lot of software options available to you. I'll say I have a slide at the end of this with a number of links to some recommended programs, not just for recovery, but for some fixed and migration and some of the other things that I was talking about. So that will hopefully be a bit of a guide to you in the future for starting somewhere with these. But if you aren't comfortable investigating these software options, if you're for the less tech savvy, there are obviously commercial services available. They will vary in terms of cost, in terms of how open they are about what they're doing and how they will recover your data. It's always, the more they tell you about their processes, the better. And in terms of just literal geographic proximity, there's plenty of services that are, say, mail-in, that say like, oh, send us your drives, send us your failing disks, and we'll copy over the data and send you a new copy. I really recommend, if you're going the commercial route, to a paid commercial service, to, if at all possible, find a local person or company that you can just literally drop your media off yourself. And that's not so much a trust thing, or at least not for the data recovery service, but for the mail. I don't recommend. There's just so many concerns with both you packaging a drive, especially a drive that you're concerned is failing properly, off to another state or another town, and then them also packaging the new drive properly and sending it back to you. I would rather you go local. I think that's my general recommendation to people in terms of evaluating services to look at. Just to sort of summarize and wrap up, though, I want to emphasize again that I'm sorry that there's sort of no one-size-fits-all solutions. Hopefully some recommendations that I have come through as we've been talking about the various options available. But really, it's going to break down to a conversation on these topics with the person and what storage strategy is right for them, whether it's a person, whether it's a family, whether it's an institution. It's going to matter how much you have in terms of the size of your data. Are we talking megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes? You know, that's going to affect what media formats you go with, how expensive it's going to be. Budget is always overwhelming concern and the hardest thing to work with people usually, but you got to work around it. It's a practicality, and I never begrudge anyone not being able to take on a more sophisticated digital preservation strategy, because you know it can get expensive, and but the thing is to emphasize that it can be the line between not having your family photos in the future or having them. You know, growth, whether you expect those collections to grow in the future, which we probably all do with our digital collections in terms of there being more digital photos, more digital videos, more files, etc. But how quickly that's going to grow is going to affect how much storage you have to buy, how often you have to migrate it, etc., etc. Users, who's trying to access your collection? Are you trying to share it with your family? Are you trying to share it with a community? That's going to affect your cloud storage options or how you choose to access your files. And then again, these questions of support and whether you're being supported by a commercial vendor or developer, or whether there's just a wide community adoption, people you can ask about the questions and the issues you're having. That's always something you want to look into and ask people about. And then I'm just going to, very quickly run down. These are just some resources that I've linked to. Hopefully these can be available to you one way or another in terms of options that I would either have some direct experience with myself and can recommend, or have been recommended by what I would call reliable sources for data recovery, sort of do-it-yourself options for software, some tools for file fixity, verifying checksums, like I said, aimed at like a digital preservation perspective and maintaining your files rather than an encryption perspective. File transfer, safely copying from one drive to another. And I did also want to specifically just shout out, since I come from an audiovisual preservation perspective, and I know lots of you are setting up analog media digitization stations as well, that the thing that tends to really throw people off when planning their digital collections is often the size of video files. So these are a couple of useful tools for plugging in, the amount of time in terms of hours, like estimating via video format and codecs and all of the other concerns that you have with analog audiovisual media into digital media, how much data you're going to end up with at the end of that process, so that people can be more informed when they're trying to plan for the next step of their digital storage strategy. So that's my long-winded spiel. Got some contact info here, but hopefully at this point, Siobhan, we might be able to open it up for questions.
So thank you, Ethan, so much. That was so great. And I think exactly just what we needed. So I have like a really weirdly random and somewhat related question that I'll start off with, and then I also muted everybody during the thing because I have the power to do that, so I did it. So I will unmute you guys in a second once I ask Ethan. So you were talking about adapters and the Apple dongle hell that we now live in, whatever stage of hell that is. And it is very interesting to me that I personally have come across, just from my own experience, that a lot of those dongles also not working. Like, obviously, like, you have to buy it from Apple. I've bought some from, this might not be a question. I might be one of those annoying.
No, I mean, that's the thing to ask to look out for, specifically with Apple and with dongles and cables, is I know everyone always is looking for a way to cheat around that system in terms of like, oh, I saw these third-party like cheaper options, and I get it. I get the instinct to go for the cheaper option, and sometimes they work, but you just got to know that like it's
not like going to a grocery store and buying the, off-brand cereal.
The whole point that Apple, makes these cables and makes these connectors specifically for themselves, and maybe occasionally licenses them out to manufacturers, is like they want you to buy their stuff. You're gambling, and maybe it's worth gambling because you can buy 2 of the same cable or connector for the same price as one Apple approved version. But if you want the steady, so again, that's the support question,
But also that's where I'm like, I feel like, personally, I feel like it's not really compatible, even though I know it is. It's like, because the other thing is what we're dealing with, using a AD converter, that's cheap enough and whatnot, that has Thunderbolt 2, it exports or connects to the computer via Thunderbolt 2. So, and now of course this is especially a difficulty now with the new Mac Mini coming out and the old Mac Mini. Anyway, but yeah, I've just constantly got questions like, but wait, Thunderbolt 2 is compatible with Thunderbolt 3, so you could use a newer. But I'm like capturing. I don't know what you think about that. I don't feel comfortable using an adapter when I'm capturing video. I don't know. Do I have a good scientific reason for that?
No, I mean, there is, in that you've introduced another level of failure into the physical level of failure into the chain. You've introduced an adapter that could get loose, and that absolutely could be a problem, especially when you're digitizing video. And the like, right, there are all sorts of concerns even with when they say Thunderbolt 3 is compatible backwards with Thunderbolt 2. It's like, well, under like certain ideal circumstances that they tested between certain devices and between certain implementations, right? So it's like yes, but yeah, there are. It's obviously a concern.
Yeah, I can't get any vendor to that sells these things to tell me, yes, we can guarantee you that it'll work. You know what I mean? They'll be like, it should work.
Yeah, and that's partially because of the new, particularly with Thunderbolt 3 and the new physical connectors and the new protocol, like there just hasn't been the time to test that. I'd say like from Thunderbolt 2, like the first couple of versions in Thunderbolt, like back to FireWire, that worked pretty well, especially with like DV tape and like connecting up DV tape decks to newer Mac Minis or Macs with the Thunderbolt 1 or 2 connector. I'd personally, like, as long as I could find the physical adapter and like connect the cables, I never saw any issues with that. Whether that's going to be true moving forward, the more we move forward, the further we get away from those analog situations, the less Apple cares about it. So I'm curious if people still are getting requests for DVD, CD-ROM, or is that just, yeah?
I mean, I can say yes, definitely.
All the time, yeah. Yeah, it's so hard, especially like, there are, especially that user question of like who you want to share it with. Like, I totally get that there are people who still have those decks, and that is how they want to access them, and I totally get that. I guess I would just say, from a planning and a digital storage perspective, just don't have it be the only copy. Like, that's the advantage of digital media. We can make lots of copies, and we can come up with these plans, and like DVD copy for aunt whoever. But
yeah, I've found too that at least the thumb drives, people tend to, for some reason, I think it's about having a physical thing, and a CD is this thing that they're like, oh, it reminds them of, so at least with the little thumb drives, I feel like people have become more comfortable with those, but the external hard drive, for some reason, we haven't quite jumped to that, even though it's like the same sort of idea, but it's just having to have the wire as well, maybe. I'm not sure what.
From a portability perspective or something about it.
That's just from that's so anecdotal, personally. So let's say for your, 3-2-1 storage strategy, whatever, for your personal stuff, so your personal video, like home movies. Let's say you have a lot of home movies that have been digitized, and like, what would you personally, what cloud storage would you go with?
I mean, I can say this. Yeah, I can say what I do. But for the home movies, I use I have 2 cloud services, I would say, actually, because I use Google Drive all the time just for sharing with people, because it's kind of the lowest common denominator platform. And that was for me to send a link to my parents and be like, hey, here's this video of us. And then I also really like a company called Spider Oak, because they do encrypted backups. So if your privacy is a concern and everything around data security and scraping is an issue, they're what's called a zero knowledge backup company. So they don't know, they don't look at your files, they can't read any of it, they're not going to sell you ads based on anything that you upload into their storage company.
That's cool.
It's paid, so like you gotta, I forget what the plan is per month. I get like 150 gigs for $10 a month or something. They're on the more expensive side. They're kind of, they're one of those companies that build their service around privacy, and if they ever lost that, they lose their business. So I kind of trust that a little bit more. And then I also have a hard drive copy, that I have one of those My Passports, those Western Digital hard drives that I mentioned earlier, that I also keep those on. And it's about 4 years old at this point, so actually I should start looking into buying another one.
One of the main reasons why I wanted Ethan to come in and talk about this is because I felt like I wanted you guys to have a little bit more empowerment and confidence about answering people's questions. So hopefully you feel that way. I feel that way. I always I feel like sometimes I've learned this stuff, but it's so good to have the refresher, and I definitely learned a few things today too. So thank you.
And the sad thing is just that is kind of adjusting people to the new reality, I think, of we're not going to be able to put it on a shelf or keep it in a box in the closet forever as it once was. I think that's honestly the hump that I need to get most people over when I talk about these sorts of things with them. It's just like, it's going to be an ongoing thing. You're going to have to think about it a little harder.
Yeah, it's almost like working out. Like you have, it's like good for you. But yes, I think that's a key thing, that also managing people's expectations. So putting that out there right away and being like, there is no cookie cutter, one size fits all solution. But we can help you think about, the library can be there to help them think about and then point them to the resources to answer their own questions and come up with their own, regimen, so to speak. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ethan. I just really appreciate it. That was great. And thank you. I'm very grateful for you all for coming to our November webinar.